What if I told you that the same simple rules that let ants find the shortest path around a rock might also explain your memories, your thoughts, and even the rise of artificial intelligence? I'm Autumn Finef, and this is Breaking Math. Today, we're diving into the question, is AI really that different from us? To help us untangle it, I'm here with two brilliant minds. Jay Mcclelland, a professor of psychology at Stanford, whose pioneering work on neural networks shaped the way today's AI models are built, and Gaurav Suri, his former student turned polymath. He's been a consultant, an entrepreneur, a novelist, and now runs his own research lab at San Francisco State University. Together, they've written The Emergent Mind, a book that asks us how intelligence arises, whether in people or in machines. And trust me, the answers might just change the way you see both your brain and the algorithm shaping our world. The big question that I have to ask today is AI that different from the human mind? From where you're standing right now, what's the single most important similarity and the single most important difference between human brains and AI?
Okay, similarity and difference. So the similarity is, in my book, that it's useful to understand both the emergence of the human mind and the emergence of intelligence in artificial systems using the neural network framework. What is the neural network framework? That's a question. So it's a framework that's inspired by the brain, in which neurons that by themselves can't do mathematics or write poetry interact with each other as a system from which thought and math and poetry emerge, right? So it's a network, literally a network of processing units that are themselves simple, but in their aggregate are capable of producing thought and intelligence. That is a neural network. It's inspired by the brain, and in the brain, the computing components are neurons. In artificial systems, we call them units, which are inspired by neurons, and they activate just like neurons do, and they influence each other via weighted connections. That means connections, meaning the influence can be strong or weak or positive or negative. So there's a network of things influencing each other, receiving input from the outside world, getting activated, activating each other. And this activation is cascading through the framework and producing some kind of output, maybe an action or a decision. So it turns out that neural networks that Jay and others developed to understand the human mind are very useful in understanding and constructing artificial systems. So that's my similarity vote. And my difference vote is that by themselves, artificial systems are not goal-directed. And now, what is a goal and where do our goals come from? And it turns out that there's many sources of our goals. Our earliest goals have to do with our physiological needs of thirst and hunger, and those want to come back to some sort of homeostatic state. But then there are other inherent bodily needs that are enforced by our environment, our culture, need to belong to a group, for example, need to proceed with autonomy, need to be effective. These are not physiological needs, but do emerge and they drive our behavior often over decades. And this thing, which is integrally tied to molecules in our body and our brains, is where these representations we call goals come from. And there is no precise equivalent of this in AI systems. For me, that's the biggest difference.
The crucial unifying factor from the point of view of the actual models that we build when we're modeling the human mind or we're building an AI system for the sake of having a chat with somebody or recognizing images of photographs or whatever it might be. These systems use the concept of patterns of activity represented by vectors of numbers and patterns of connections between populations of neurons represented by matrices of numbers as the core elements of the neural network systems that we use to model our brains and build our AI systems. And in our actual brains, we have these neurons and we have these connections. So it's also thought of as a model of the actual physical structure, whereby we have hundreds of we have not hundreds of billions, but about 100 billion neurons in our brain. The pattern over all of those is a huge long vector, and the connectivity they're not all connected to each other, but they're densely connected to each other so that they speak to each other and communicate with each other as a collective. And understanding that our minds and our AI systems are both those kinds of systems is, I think, a fundamental part of knowing what the discourse is about these AI systems that we have today. When I think about differences, Rob and I agree that goals are very important. Another difference, which is very, very striking, is that we as human beings learn far more efficiently than our artificial systems do today. And for example, the big language models in use today are trained with 100,000 times more training data than a human being would ever experience in their lifetime. So how does our human brain achieve so much greater efficiency in its ability to learn? That is one of the key unanswered questions right now in neuroscience, I think. Neuroscientists do not understand how to build anything, a model that would have the capabilities of these large language models. And they certainly don't know how to do it, with that much greater efficiency. So there's a huge mystery that remains to be solved about how our human minds get to be such capable learners. Yeah. So those similarities and differences.
So what I realized going through this book is that you both played a role in shifting AI away from all of these rigid rules towards learning systems. So would you like to go into that history a little bit with me? And why did rule-based AI hit a wall? And how did your PDP connectionist work really help break through this?
Well, I have a very strong point of view on this particular subject. And I guess the key point that I like to emphasize in this context is that our natural cognitive abilities always exist in a world where the rules that people try to write don't always work perfectly. So, for example, there's a very simple rule for describing the past tense of words in English, right? You add ed to a present tense of a word to make its past tense. However, that isn't always true. Sometimes you say, instead of sing, you say sang, right? But often enough, you do something that's pretty similar to the standard thing, but you just tweak it a little bit. So the past tense of love is loved. You added ed there. The past tense of have isn't halved. You kind of like compressed it a little bit, right? You made it a little bit sort of easier to say. So there's a second thing happening there. There's like a word that you say very frequently. You kind of want to make it more efficient. So you kind of compress it a little bit. That means the rules don't fit perfectly anymore. When we speak to each other in natural language, we use phrases that have idiomatic meanings that nobody could capture by rules. And, it's very hard for people learning rules in a second language textbook to pick up on what those things mean, right? But the neural networks, by virtue of their use of these graded patterns of activation over populations of neurons and connection weights that gradually learn in the context of the whole distribution of possible words and ways people say things, can sort of work their way around all those little nuances while also being sensitive to the regularities in the system. And so they end up having the advantage of being able to mold themselves fluently around the idiosyncrasies of things while still somehow capturing the pattern of regularity so that they do successfully generalize to novel instances. And this was a key debate in the 1980s. Could you actually build a system that would generalize properly without building in the rules per se? And it's still a very central issue. There are still part of the limits that neural networks still have. Maybe some of the aspects of their inefficiency in learning relates to this issue, but by virtue of having all that data, they are able to pick up on the nuances and therefore exploit them in ways that systems that were built around rules haven't been able to do and probably never will, I would say.
So Jay talked about the perspective on language, right? So this idea where people are we're trying to maybe continue trying to systemize rules inherent in language. There's a parallel thing that goes on when we think about our decisions and why we do the things that we do. And, if we try to make a rule about our decisions, probably a simple rule is we do things that bring us value, maximize our value, right? Why do we take chocolate over vanilla? Chocolate gives us more value. Why do we drive, not walk? Because the benefit of the exercise was less than the convenience. So there's this trade-off between costs and benefits, and that certainly seems like a rule. And when you think about decision-making, and to this day, as people want to design systems that act in the world, they're often basing their system on this rule of value maximization. There's a value calculus. And the neural network approach is sensitive to things that yield outcomes that are beneficial to the organisms, but aren't limited to a single rule, right? Because they're an interaction. And there's the word emergence is in our title, and I want to underline that word. So there's activations that are related to benefits and costs, but there's also activations that are related to attention, what you happen to be looking at, or what you did the last time you were in that room, or what the person before you just did, or you're looking at a menu and you see a photograph of something on top, which is closer to your field of vision. All of these are producing activations. All of these are entering your system, and they're interacting with, gee, how much do I like that salad whose pictures I saw? But now that salad maybe has more activation because the picture was front and center. And what did the person in front of me order? And all of these things are interacting to produce decisions. So the rule is not missing. The value is not missing from the neural network perspective. But the neural network perspective is not hard coding or not limiting itself to this single calculation. And to me, these issues of rules in language or rules in decisions they have a parallelism to them, which is the human longing to understand things often requires rules. That's just how we approach understanding. Working with neural networks suggests that it's useful to sort of think about systems from which these things emerge.
So looking at how to scale, whether that's more neurons, more data, or more layers, quantitatively change what these systems can do and that you're building?
This is a very interesting question that has been the focus of study both in the real nervous system and in AI systems. And the parallels, again, are very, very striking to me. The argument has been made in some circles that what makes the human mind different from animal minds is some special bit of circuitry, maybe that, for example, can do a recursive computational operation. The alternative perspective is that the human brain has essentially scaled up the architecture of more mammals' brains, and the input we're dealing with, vision or audition or actually, let's say, touch or movement. We keep scaling up the parts between them so that we can do more and more computations on top of them. There are more separate brain areas that are more interconnected, just like more layers in the network. And the work with neural networks has, I think, been the place where these benefits of scale can become very, very palpably studied by a simple process of just running a whole bunch of different sizes of networks, numbers of layers of networks, numbers of amount of training data. Also gives the opportunity to explore the trade-offs between these things and the idea that, as the complexity of the data grows, the complexity of the network that's going to be able to exploit that data has to grow. And what exactly is that relationship? These are all things that can be studied almost from an empirical and descriptive point of view. Run the model with different size data and different numbers of layers, the sizes of those vectors and matrices that I mentioned. And you can get these laws. What's interesting, though, is I think we don't understand why these laws hold exactly. And that is part of what remains, a part of the mystery of emergence and the mystery of why this scaling can actually succeed in the way that it does. I personally feel that we know there's this 100,000-fold difference in amount of training data that we machines require. So there's some, factor, right? A multiplier somewhere that's way off in these scaling laws as we understand them so far. And that's an important place for further investigation and further exploration. But it's definitely true that both in the brain and in our artificial systems, scale changes what can be accomplished. It has led to things that nobody expected they would see.
Now, I know when you're looking at some of the scales and when you're looking at various patterns, you go into one example in the book that was referring to an ant colony. It's essentially, why does emergence matter so much for understanding cognition and AI? And why was this ant colony's analogy so intuitive?
Right. Yeah. Thank you for identifying that. That's one of my favorite examples. And for me, really captures the spirit of the book. So what is the example? The example is that if you have a train of ants and they're going from their nest to, let's say, a food source, imagine they're going back and forth. It's a straight line, let's say, just to simplify. And what you do is you put an obstacle midway, and now the ants have to decide, are they going to go left or are they going to go right? And let's also imagine that you arrange the obstacle so that one way is the short way and one way is the long way, right? Now, one thing this experiment has been done both in the lab and out in the wild, including by me in the wild. And what you find is that ants in a few minutes will go the short way. Initially, about half the ants go one way, half the ants go the other way. But in a few minutes, most of the ants are going the short way. Now, the question is why? And I remember when I saw this, I asked my son, do you have a theory about this? And his theory was maybe the queen ant sort of can suss out what's the short way. And maybe there's a way these ants have a way to communicate. And it turns out that ants don't have the cognitive machinery about distance. And no, they can do none of that. They're actually, as individual ants are not terribly smart, but colonies of ants are extremely smart. So the question is, how are they doing it? Well, the way they're doing it is ants are laying pheromone trails, and pheromone trails on the short path get more concentrated. And we explain in the book how this happens. You get more concentrated than pheromone trails on the long path. And so when an individual ant has to make a decision, it makes a decision based on, I'm just following the greater concentration of pheromones. And it reinforces that decision. And lo and behold, then most of the ants are taking the short way. Now, the reason this is so interesting is the ant colony has the intelligence to figure out what's the short way, what's the long way, even though an individual ant does not, right? No individual ant can solve this problem. So this is an example of emergence. Emergence is where the property is found in the whole system, but it's not found in any of the individual parts. So this is the emergence. Now, hopefully your listeners are saying, okay, so the brain, none of our neurons can by themselves do mathematics, and yet interacting with each other, they can. And so this emergence is happening. Ants are laying pheromone and following pheromone. Neurons are activating with these things we call action potentials that are bolts of electricity, bing, 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 at various speeds, and are influencing other neurons to do the same. And from those interactions, our intelligence emerges. And so a useful metaphor for our brains is a colony of ants, which are interacting with each other and are doing amazing cognitive feats that are possible in the aggregate, but not in the individual.
Let's get into now how the brain actually stores information and how it compares with AI. So you have a couple topics, whether it's been hallucinations and distributed representations that you talk about in the book, right? Can you explain distributed representations, and also how does this approach enable similarity categories and taxonomies?
So a distributed representation is a pattern of activation over a population of neurons. In the brain, very physically, that's exactly what we mean by that. So that, for example, when I'm looking at somebody's face, there are neurons in many, many regions of my brain that are being activated by this. And two very, very similar faces will actually produce quite similar patterns of activation over different populations of neurons. What's deeply important and interesting is that, even if the size of the image changes like radically so that the actual neurons on the retina that are activated by it, are very, very different from each other. Higher levels in the brain have sorted this out so that a very similar pattern is produced in a place, in a few patches of neurons, which are specifically involved in representing faces. And so, the way the brain solves the problem of variantly recognizing an object in spite of changes of its position in an image or its scale is by figuring out how to map these very different patterns on the input down to a place where they're very, very similar overlapping patterns at some higher level of representation. But it's not like there's a neuron for Jay Mcclelland or Autumn. There's a different pattern for each of us. And that's the key idea. So two views of the very same person will produce two very, very similar patterns. Two views of two very different people will produce very distinct patterns. And those patterns are what we mean by distributed representation. So where the sort of interesting power of this, but also its potential fallibility comes in, is that if we see many examples, each of which is unique, but which, when averaged, produce a pattern that we've never seen, it can be the case that that pattern that we've never seen seems like the one we've seen the most. And this is a natural consequence of the way these patterns work, because if the overlap is sufficiently high, they tend to average with each other and sort of create a sense of, the average is the most familiar and typical thing, and that's what I'm going to say, that's the one that I've seen. So that's one kind of hallucination that this kind of system can give rise to. In general, these models, because they don't store the individual patterns as such, but they store changes in the connection weights between the units that participate in them, they tend to have an averaging effect so that eventually they're picking up on commonalities more strongly than differences. And those tendencies are what, essentially correspond on the one hand to things that are rule-like, but on the other hand, can sometimes be, in fact, errors, right? So the overregularization tendency that we all have to sometimes think that the past tense of an exception is the regular or more typical kind is a consequence of this process.
The key thing that I'm hoping your listeners take away on storage is, in a neural network, memory and knowledge are represented in the connections. So if I say green and you say grass, it's because neurons that respond to the sound of green are influencing neurons that respond to the word grass. And so that knowledge is in the connections. And a distributed representation is a representation of something that is produced by these connections. This is a really lovely story that happened to me yesterday. There's a student in my class, he sits in the front row, always asks questions, and I look at him. This happened yesterday. And I say, something's off. And I can't figure out what's off, right? I'm looking at him and he's smiling at me. And it turns out that it's the twin. It's not. So I'm reminded of the story from what Jay is saying. So the distributed representation that my connections produced of his face was very similar to what his twin produced, but not identical. And the discomfort I was feeling was related to that difference and that commonality. The contrast to distributed representation is localist representations, where I have one neuron for the twin and another neuron for the original student. But that means those neurons are as different from each other as my neuron would be for you, Autumn. So it's much better to do patterns, more efficient.
I've never had a student swap with their twin in any of my classes. So that's a new one for me. But essentially, memory isn't like a video recording. What are some of those advantages and disadvantages in these reconstructive systems?
Yeah. So, Jabe likes to point to playwright, Harold Pinter, who talked about the mistiness of memory. I love that expression. And in one of our chapters, we talk about this TV show which is told from two perspectives. And it's amazing how one perspective is so different from the other perspective, even though neither of the persons wants to be lying. Or intends to be lying. So the advantage of this malleability, this mistiness, is that it allows for this generalization that that Jay is talking about. So if we have seen many instances that are one way, then we can extend and say, oh, this new thing that I'm seeing is probably like that. And without this ability to make concepts, we wouldn't be able to make our way in the world. But it's not a recording, and it has the fact that it's not a recording that's objectively the same for all people means that we all construct memories differently based on the same events, because the constructions based on who we are. Who we are affects the connections that we make in our brain. That's, that is a facet of our memory. But without this ability to generalize from things that resemble each other but are not the same, and be able to have knowledge about these things, be able to predict their properties is a huge useful property of our knowledge system.
So if we're thinking about higher level thinking, whether this is logic, math, and how we build some of the models in our world, is formal logic an emergent construction built on top of experience rather than a built-in module?
That's what we like to think. The way I like to put it is that for hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors began to diverge from other animals, other apes, and began to develop language, bigger brains, modes of communication with each other that allowed them to communicate at a distance with language and so on. And the languages of the world that we use today to speak with each other arose naturally in that context as diverse groups broke off and spread around the world and populated it. But it wasn't until human beings settled down, had leisure time, had goods and services that they wanted to document and save records of and so on, that people began to actually ask themselves questions about, well, how should we, in fact, optimally record and make records of and keep track of and make inferences about things like the quantity of objects that we have. Like, if one person has 3 sheep and another person has 4 sheep, how many sheep is that altogether, for example? It turns out that this concept of number, just the basic idea of having exact quantification of, how many discrete items like sheep you have, is something that probably didn't come into existence until a few tens of thousand years ago, and maybe didn't really become systematic until people actually had the ability to notate them and form records that they could keep and inspect and think about and share with each other and so on. So the invention of notation systems became externally constructed resources that then we can share with each other, we can teach each other, we can think about, refine, and develop further. And those culturally constructed things then become themselves the emergent objects that constrain the way we think and allow us to go way beyond what our ancestors could do without those systems that we feed back into ourselves and structure the way we think with. So I've been thinking quite a lot about the basic notion of exact quantity, which very strikingly some cultures completely lack. They have no words for even exactly one object, and they apparently don't even think about whether there's exactly the same number of items in 2 sets. It's just not something that ever comes up in their culture, has no meaning for them, and they have no system for it. So our human cognitive abilities, as we experiencing them today, depend on this sort of substrate, this biological process that we've been talking about mostly throughout this talk, together with these invented systems that mathematicians and philosophers developed over time that then become the tools that allow us to extend our abilities, keeping that flexibility of the parallel distributed sort of approximative and potentially hallucinating from time to time kind of characteristics, while also being able to cross-check it with some system of ground truth that is in fact a completely constructed thing outside of our native human.
So with that, the big question that I have is math. Was it invented, discovered, or both? And how does this framework actually resolve that classic debate?
Yeah, so this is a question that we both think a lot about. I think what Jay just said can be summarized that we invented the instruments of math when we were counting sheep. So if we were living on Jupiter and there was nothing that had a identifiable object, everything molded into each other, one can imagine there would be no need to invent the idea of number. But when we want to count sheep, right? When we want to count sheep, we got to invent number. Or when we want to divide a field, we got to have some way of measuring equality of area. So our culture nudges us to develop the instruments of mathematics. And we humans are capable of asking questions from one context into other contexts. So a classic example of this is you have a set of 5 things and it's equal to another set of 5 things. So 5 dogs and 5 cats, that's the same number of. And Cantor, a mathematician, starts applying that question to infinite sets. So we do have the ability to start with these basic instruments and then extend and ask questions about big patterns in the universe. Now, the patterns in the universe are there, right? So if we ask a question about the periodicity of planets, we will derive that they go in an ellipse shape. That's not invented by humans. That's a pattern that exists out there. So in that sense, that's discovered. The fact that planets go around in this elliptical object is a discovery, but that discovery is made possible by the invention of these instruments of mathematics, right? So we invent things to solve problems in front of us. We extend them because that's what we can do. We can apply instruments in one domain to another domain. In the process, we can examine regularities using mathematical language because it seems that this language is extremely well suited to documenting regularities. And it gets to the point where we can just follow the regularity. We can just follow the beauty of an equation and use that to make a prediction. But ultimately, it starts with an invention to solve a concrete problem, and it discovers patterns in the universe.
Now, as AI is going to discover these patterns, what tricks does the brain use to learn efficiently than AI, which is still struggling here?
There is a kind of a distinction that I can perhaps offer, or at least a clue that's recently been introduced by neuroscientists that has made me think that we'll be learning more about this soon. So when we have thought about learning in the brain up until very recently, there's this notion that Donald Hebb, a very early sort of neural network kind of thinker like us, who wanted to say, okay, how do our intelligent abilities arise from these neurons? He had this idea about learning. He said that when one neuron fires and participates in firing another one, that makes it have an action potential, then the connection between the two of them will change. And this is something that neuroscientists have studied, and that is the fundamental sort of idea in neural networks. We have little adjustments that occur in connections based on the activation in the two neurons. The recent discovery is that actually sometimes neurons do something that's very different from just having an action potential. Sometimes they go into an action potential is a little event that lasts for a millisecond or so and then dies out and becomes possible again another millisecond or 5 or 10 milliseconds later. But these other events are events that last for a third to 2/3 of a second. They're a meta event within neurons, which makes it possible for an individual neuron to completely remap its connections and to adjust how it's learning about other neurons that are fired within a much larger time window than we previously imagined. So instead of events having to happen within 10 or so milliseconds of each other, one neuron firing and then the other one firing within a very, very short time window, it now turns out that this time window can be on the order of 2 or 3 seconds, and you could still build an association between activities. So this is something we haven't figured out how to integrate into models of how learning occurs beyond the level of what goes on in the rodents in which it's been discovered. It's something that I think our AI systems also might be able to do the same.
So, as we're looking at our AI systems running more effectively and efficiently, if embodiment is essentially key, what is the minimum body that an AI would need to become goal directed, essentially, without running amok?
Well, this learning algorithm that Jay was describing is crucially dependent on neuromodulators, right? So these potentials, these longer term things that occur because of neuromodulators. Now, when are neuromodulators released? Well, it seems like evolution has really developed these signals of this event is worth a neuromodulator release for the survival of the organism. And so there's literally our entire evolutionary heritage has been gone into when these neuromodulators are secreted and then their impact on our learning process. Now, it's very possible that we'll be able to get shortcuts for AI systems like hacks. We don't have to replicate the entire evolutionary process. But I will say that there's a lot of complexity here. I don't have a good sense of whether the hacks are going to get 80% of the answer or 20% of the answer. To me, that's an empirical question. But I love that you use the word embodied, because I am increasingly thinking that it's the network is in the entire body. The entire body is influencing each other. There was an article I was reading about 40,000 neurons in the heart, which are differentially impacted in heartbreak than other neurons in the brain. This is amusing to think about. But my point is that the neural network is, in some sense, the network in the body. And we are evolutionarily formed creatures. And can we find useful shortcuts? Perhaps. To me, TBD.
I've noticed that you take an agnostic stance on consciousness in the book. And if intelligence doesn't require consciousness, what functional role might consciousness actually serve? And essentially, could AI ever become conscious? And does it matter? I know it's a loaded question.
In my entire career, I have shied away from thinking about consciousness because it doesn't lend itself naturally to mechanistic study. That is to say, the experience of exactly how it is that delicious chocolate ice cream tasted or anything like that. That's called the hard problem of consciousness, and it's extremely difficult to make progress on. So the reason that I end up feeling agnostic, though, is that there is this sense that one has that the qualities of our experience are themselves things that motivate us to achieve that. That deliciousness that I experience is something I work for. Sense of chagrin, embarrassment that I can have if I make a stupid mathematical mistake is something I work to avoid, right? I feel that. How embarrassing it was for me to have made that mistake. And that's a signal for me to pay attention and not let that happen again, right? So those experiential elements tend to co-occur with things that are extremely important in making the adjustments that allow us to work towards the goals that Rob was talking about before. And when those goals become really important emergent goals, like goals of social justice or equity or things like that, but they tend to lose that concreteness to them of the more physiologically grounded ones that were built around. And so I feel that to the extent that they accompany things that are evolutionarily built into us, they are certainly accompaniments of things that are functionally significant.
So, I agree with Jay that the hard problem, it's maybe not the first point of attack just because it is a really hard problem. I think it is possible, as Jay started to allude, is functionally, what is the function of consciousness? And here one can sort of start making some progress, right? So we were talking about, for example, drinking when thirsty, and that satisfies some cells. It brings them back to homeostasis. But that process, increasingly finding out, takes a lot of time. The cell coming back to homeostasis is not instant, right? So you need a feeling that maybe can help guide that, oh, this thing will bring your cell, accompanies the feeling of the cells coming back to homeostasis. I'm not saying that's the purpose of consciousness. I'm giving that as an example that one can think about from a functional perspective. What roles could conscious experience play in guiding our system? To me, what's amazing in our book is how far we can come without relying on these things, right? Because you'd think that consciousness is the mind, right? And Freud was wrong about a few things, but what he was right about, which for me was equally earth-shattering as the Copernican discovery, was that the mind is not just the conscious thought. He intuited this from talking to people. And what our framework, this general framework, shows is that, look, you can talk about perception, you can talk about action, you can talk about language, you can talk about memory, you can talk about even these mathematics to some extent without relying on the existence of conscious thought. I think it's really important to take a functional perspective, and I think it's really important to be struck by the fact how far we can come without consciousness in the system.
Here and now of AI risks. We know that there's bottlenecks, and how to use technology responsibly. Now, what's more worrying for people right now? AI with its own goals, or humans misusing AI for deep fakes and persuasion?
So you're raising very important questions, and the perspective I have about this is that it's sort of the humans behind the scenes that are the crucial elements to worry about, at least in the immediate term, for two reasons, right? For the one reason related to what you just said, people can decide they want to use AI to do things that are nefarious and misleading and abusive of people's, credulity and things like that, and that can be extremely harmful. And so just as any technology, could be used for good or for ill, people can be the bad actors in this setting, and deliberately so. So this is something we need to figure out as a society how to manage and regulate. At the same time, the good uses of AI are also in large measure the consequences of the goals of their creators. Those goals, even in the those who think of themselves as being the most responsible kinds of actors in the world, could go wrong, could go in ways that are unintended. Many policies have been generated by governments that they thought were going to turn out to be great policies, and they turned out to have fatal flaws and devastatingly bad for, and needed to be corrected or still need to be corrected in our societies. So what I think personally is that in both of these contexts, we need to figure out ways of organizing human oversight so as to ensure that, when the actors are deliberately acting with nefarious purposes, or even when they're not trying to, we still have oversight and the opportunity to correct and redirect, and that we need to be keeping ourselves responsible for the outcomes.
So, what can everyday people take away from this work? So, whether that's habits that you may have changed because of understanding emergence, or even seeing some humans as processes change in the way that you treat others.
Yeah. What I hope people take away from this book is a better understanding of who they are. And for me, that understanding by itself is an end in itself, right? It's an eternal question. Who are we? What kinds of things are we? And what the answer to that eternal question reveals some things that we should consider in living better lives. And Autumn, I take you to be asking about, okay, well, great. What can I take away from this view of the mind to living a better life? And what this view of the mind really exposes is that there isn't a central different entity, directing controller inside us that's either good or bad or wicked or idealistic. We are processes, right? We are processes. There's input from the world. It comes in. We have existing connections due to our biology. We have connections that change with our experience. These connections influence how input from the world cascades in our neural network and produces action. And we're a process, like water going down a hill is a process. We are a process of this earth, of this universe, no less than the trees and the stars, but also no more. And the fact that we are a process is just a fundamentally different way of looking at each other and other people. Because when we disagree, there's two possible attributions that we could say. I'm disagreeing with this person because their inner controller, their inner machinery is flawed, and I reject them, and I want nothing to do with them. Or one could say, well, they're a process, just like I'm a process. They're coming to this conclusion. So what is their context? Where are they coming from? If you remove this idea that people are inherently, there's just this inherent goodness or wickedness, you open yourself to understanding them and ourselves as a process. And for me, that's a breakthrough because that gives you a superpower. And the superpower is understanding and patience. We are directed by our biology to act in some ways. And sometimes we disappoint each other. And our biological reactions to that disappointment may be anger, maybe frustration. But if we can give ourselves that time and that perspective to say this other person is doing this as an unfolding process and have that gap between our understanding or our experience of what they're doing and our reaction to it, so that we can pause and say, just like I'm a process, that helps us be kinder and helps us be more patient. And for me, that's the source of morality, right? If we can get there. And then what we have to do is what Jay was talking in respect to machines. Like we need safeguards for our machines. We also need safeguards for each other, because sometimes processes go wrong in ways that would harm other people. So we need safeguards, right? So this is not an invitation to accept everything. No, we need safeguards in order to be a functioning society. And the neural network view is actually underlining the need for those safeguards, because those safeguards are context. That's what I hope your listeners take away.
I myself struggle with a part of what I think the ultimate goal could be beyond what Roth is saying to a certain extent, which is not only to have safeguards so that we can keep people from falling off the edge of the cliff, but to have ways of optimizing our education systems, our ways of thinking about each other in daily life that, lead us to find a more constructive path to begin with, and not be in a position where, we need to bring in the guardrails all the time. So it's more like trying to figure out, what's the best way to ensure that a child is raised with the right attitudes and perspectives and inclinations to live together with all the other children of the world who will be the leaders of the future, as opposed to, just building the guardrails themselves. So I feel that, with understanding ultimately could come better social organizations, better institutions, and better processes for orchestrating our interactions and our learning with each other. But that goes beyond mere understanding to social organization in ways that are beyond my control.
Thank you both for coming on the show. And what originally started with ants dodging obstacles brings us right back to us, our brains, our memories, our sense of self, and the strange parallel story of machines learning to think. Now, maybe the real lesson is that intelligence, whether in carbon or silicone, isn't magic at all. It's the patterns, connections, and emergence. And yet somehow knowing that doesn't make it any less extraordinary. Until next time, keep finding wonder in the rules beneath the surface. Stay curious. And now a message from our sponsors. What is the Curiosity Box? It's the world's first subscription for thinkers created by Vsauce, the science network with over 23 million fans. Each season brings a new adventure in science, puzzles, and exploration, packed into a box designed to ignite your curiosity. The new box, a showcase of imagination and discovery. Try the 4D tape measure, part ruler, part pendulum, that measures both space and time. Play with Mr. Wiggle's Giggle Jiggle siphons, silly-looking straws that secretly reveal the physics of fluids, and snap-on slap bracelets that double as rulers. cylinder measuring tools, and even tongue-in-cheek time-traveling credentials. Every collection is unique, filled with limited items you won't see again. Subscriptions start at $75 quarterly or $280 annually for even more savings. Available across the US, Canada, UK, Europe, and beyond. Check out thecuriositybox.com/breakingmath and get 25% off your first box with the code BREAKMATH25. Curiosity Box, because discovery should never stop.